welcome you all to Open Studio. This is our first program for Open Studio, and it's an intimate look at Black studies and engaging technology. Today we have our featured guest, Kimberly Bain, and I'm going to read you her intro, and then we can all have space to introduce ourselves. Kimberly Bain is a Ph.D. candidate in English and Interdisciplinary Humanistic Study at Princeton University. Kimberly's intellectual interests include the history, theory, and philosophy of diaspora, race, gender, postcolonialism, enslavement, flesh, environmental racism, resistance, embodiment, subjection, and subjecthood. Her dissertation, entitled On Black Breath, A Theory and Praxis, takes seriously the charge of I can't breathe and considers breath as more than the mere metaphor, rather as also a somatic and sociopolitical phenomena that has resonances in the wake of enslavement to the contemporary movement. So welcome, Kimberly. All right, and then I just want to give everyone a chance to introduce yourself, say a little bit about your interests and what brought you here today. You can start with Purdom.
So I'm Purdom. I work at MIT, and my research interests are on archives in the Anthropocene, so thinking about like how memory works in catastrophic climate change. So I love your work, so that's why I'm here.
Hi, my name is Asia. So I'm a PhD student in the sociology department here. So my work focuses on really like Black girlhood studies. So I kind of two things I study. One is birth outcomes, and then another, my other kind of thing I'm studying is Black girls in DC, and specifically Black girls in DC who have gone missing, right? And so I'm really excited to be here. I saw kind of the synopsis of your work, and so it sounds really exciting.
Okay.
My name's Stan Maxon. I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of History. I study 19th century African American history. And my dissertation focuses on the region of Middle Tennessee and attempts, it looks at Black social networks. So it attempts to reconstruct some of the social networks that Black veterans who fought in the Civil War and their families, their widows, their dependents, leveraged in order to claim a federal pension.
Okay.
I'm Trevor Munoz. I'm interim director here at MIT and one of the co-principal investigators for the AADHum initiative. And I am here. A lot of it has to do, actually, my interest today is about my interest in the sort of non-visual digital humanities. So in this case, sort of embodied experience or sound. So that connects with today's topic.
Great. Well, we have a wonderful group here. I also want to welcome our online audience and encourage everyone to tweet. We'll also be looking at the live feed and connecting with you all there, so feel free to ask questions and raise your comments. So,
hello.
Hi, how are you doing?
I am very good. I said this yesterday, but I have a cold, so my volume is a little bit variable as it goes on. But I wanted to thank you so much for the invitation. And thank you all for coming so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you to our Twitter and live stream followers. It's exciting to be here. Yeah.
Great. We're glad to have you. So I first wanted to give you the opportunity for you to talk about hold space and to think about it, or to help us think through. At AADHum, we're often looking at the implications of technology in Black studies. So if you could share about your project and then kind of walk through the technologies that you chose to use.
So Whole Space is what I'm calling a critical poetic project. It's a digital project that utilizes augmented reality and virtual reality to try to think through in a sort of non-narrative way, the sort of expansive ways we can think about breath and breathing in relation to Blackness and in relation to how Blackness is racialized, right? And so I came to the project actually, and I think that's probably it is said I wouldn't talk about narratives, but I think a narrative of how I got to the project is really crucial in thinking about how the project itself got into being. But I came to the project because as I was writing my larger project that this is in cohort with, which my larger project is called On Black Breath, a Theory and Praxis. As I was writing it, I realized that I was struggling I was grappling with a lot of questions around representation and a lot of questions of what you do when you're trying to talk about and think about and work through something that is invisible, something that is ephemeral, something that can't be touched, right? And I think a lot of issues that have to do with race and gender and sexuality and all these things are that, right? Like, even as race is written on the skin, there are lots of aspects about it, how it plays out in real life and all these things that aren't something that you can pinpoint to or you can't exactly get evidence of. You know, you can think about, you know, saying like, well, it's not what they said, but it's the way they said it, you know, often pops up when we're thinking about microaggressions or something like that, right? So how do we get to these things that are so intangible was really sort of the thing that I was rubbing up against as I was writing the larger project. And to sort of grapple with that question, I started making this, and I wish I had actually brought it, but I started making this little booklet that I didn't know what I was calling it at first. I just called it a book that would just have all these random things that I found around breath, right? So in the chapter I was writing at the time, which was on enslavement and fugitive slave narratives, and the work of the Southern doctor Samuel Cartwright, who is the one who came up with the whole diagnosis of drapetomania, which I'm sure a lot of you know, which is the affliction causing enslaved persons to run away. I was writing that chapter, and I was finding all of these like random things around breath, right? So not just, you know, in fugitive narratives that are talking about panting towards freedom, but in Cartwright's own work where he's talking about how, you know, the reason why enslaved persons were so troublesome and so hard to control was because they didn't have the right kind of oxygen in their blood. And I was finding all these other things as I was reading. You know, things were happening in real life at the time. So, you know, obviously the one that I think a lot of people turn to is Eric Garner, but Eric Harris was happening in 2015. We have all these different instances in which, you know, breathing was coming to the fore. You know, we have, I know it was brought up a little bit earlier, but Williams, when she's giving birth, you know, she nearly dies because she has a pulmonary embolism, right?
And that's Serena Williams.
Yes, Serena Williams, because she has a pulmonary embolism. And so how do we think about what's happening in enslavement with the contemporary moment? So I started making this little booklet, and I was playing around with trying to think about the invisible and the ephemeral. So I was doing things like using invisible ink that would, you know, react if you breathe on it, because, you know, it's heat reactive. And I was like layering things with tissue paper. So I draw these little diagrams that I'd put over, you know, a larger image or map and everything. And as I was putting this together, one thing I realized was things were kind of falling apart quickly because I was using, again, a lot of materials that were very tenuous. A lot of materials that are very delicate, because I wanted to try to think through the delicate membranes of the lungs as I was thinking about breath. And so as I was doing this, I was like, you know, I think another way to approach it, not another way that would get at everything I was talking about, but another way in tandem with this sort of more artistic thing that I was doing would be to turn towards digital mediums, right? Because I think digital mediums, and I think a lot of conversations, hopefully a lot of conversations around the digital is around this exact question of the ephemeral, around these exact questions of the intangible and all these things. So I turned to the digital, including AR and VR, to try to grapple with a lot of the questions that I was working through, that I was trying to work through in this little booklet that I had, which I'm not calling a palimpsest. I'm also calling the actual project a palimpsest as well, which I thank the AADHum Scholars Program for helping me work that out, because as I was presenting last spring, trying to work through things, we were throwing around all these random words, archives and all these things, and in a great conversation with Trevor and Prudhomme, they were like, you know, why don't you consider like maybe a palimpsest? And I was like, that's it, you know? It just got at, I think, a lot of the things that I was trying to grapple with, which, you know, because a palimpsest is this piece of, usually it was a piece of animal skin or flesh that was embedded, like you written on and then you wash it, you scrape it off and you write new things, but those sort of traces were what I was trying to get at, you know, those things that aren't exactly visible on the first look, but appear when you do a little bit more work. Yeah, that was a very long narrative as to how I got into this whole thing, but
yeah, that's great. I think that's a great starting point.
Yeah.
So I'm very fascinated in how you there's a breadth of different types of materials time periods that your work covers in space. So it's flowing among all different types of spaces and time. What do you see as the promise in studying Black life in that way?
So I've always been of the opinion that understanding Blackness can't only come from crafting very straightforward narratives. I think this is not to say narratives are not important. I think they are absolutely important. I think we need them because they help shape how we think about the world, the histories that we think about, the critical theory that we create and all these things. But I think there are moments in which trying to think through certain aspects that have to do with really sticky concepts and really sticky realities like race, like gender, like sexuality. I think a narrative can leave things out that are a little bit harder to fit into something that's a little bit more straightforward, right? And even in moments when, the way that I think as scholars we try to grapple with that is we use citations, hopefully. I don't know if you guys do this, but I abuse my citational practice. All of my citations are 2 pages long because I'm like, by the way, I found this random thing in this 16th century mining text that was all about breathing and breath, and let me explain this thing, And so citations kind of get to that a little bit, I think, but there's a way in which even that, if you're not a curious reader,
right.
You're not going to come across those things, right? So one of the things I was trying to grapple with is how do I put all of the messiness of Black life and Black living into the actual work from the get-go, right? And I think one of the ways that is maybe a way to approach that is to have a text, and by text I mean not just narrative text, but I mean an object that is not beholden to creating a linear narrative. I think there is still a narrative there, right? Because again, that the themes that connect a lot of these texts that I'm including in the project, and the sort of questions and the anxieties that are centralizing everything I'm working on, those are all narratives, right? And there's a narrative as to how this project came into being. But I think a linear narrative doesn't serve always the kinds of questions that we want to ask, right? And so one of the things I really want to push back in the project was this idea of order, capital O order, which is about categorizing and compartmentalizing, because I think one of the things about the history of Blackness is that how a lot of it has been about that, right? Compartmentalizing, categorizing, determining this sort of concretized way of reading race on a body, but we know that's not so easy, and so how do we play around with that and make that thing messy? So that's one of the reasons why I sort of use mess as a sort of central and core methodology in the project. I'm not going to, walk you through from, the Galenic tradition of Numa, all the way to the contemporary moment and give you this sort of easy narrative, right? I want you, as you're approaching the project, to do hard work, right? And that hard work happens in tandem with some of the things that I'm going to be doing, right? And so some of the explanation that I give, some of the context I give around things, right? So I'm never going to put something out there and just say, well, make of it what you will. Everything is always in relation to its context, right? I'm always trying to be very careful and conscious about the ways in which I present work, right? So I'm not just going to put down, an audio track of Eric Harris's last words and leave that for the viewer or the user. It's always going to be in context, what was happening in this moment? What was Eric Harris's larger life? What were the repercussions happening around that? Let's look at all these other things that were, occurring around this exact same time. And so again, that has a narrative, but that narrative is not linear. But just to tighten it up a little bit and get back to the original thing, I think just having a sort of more expansive view of how we can create knowledge is so important, right? Because we all have our own approaches to how breath and breathing ramifies and rectifies our own lives. And so I never wanted to be this is the only way to read breath, which is, I think, can happen if you have a static project, right? The written word. Sometimes I think, especially when I'm thinking about this as a pedagogical text, right? If you're teaching undergrads, if you're teaching high schools, all these things, how to create projects on their own, they can take the written word in certain ways to be the given, and I want them to play around with how they're thinking about their own approaches to these things, how anybody else can create their own knowledges around these things. And I think the best way to do that is to say, here is something, now you see what sense you can make of it, and if sense can't be made, let's think about what structures are preventing the sense from happening,
So when you talk about messiness, I often think about Fred Moten's The Undercommons, and in the sense that the work that you're doing on breath is itinerant, it's not easily categorized, it's ephemeral in a lot of ways. So how does that play out in AR and VR?
So for me, the way it sort of plays out in AR and VR is because I think one of the things that can happen is when you're sort of building AR and VR in the background, right? There are all these, they call them triggers or target images that are like attached, and I don't like to use that as the way I think of it, because I think, especially when you think about Blackness, that kind of language can be really damaging. But there are all these connections that you have to make, right? So if you're using your phone to recognize an image, or if you're using your phone to take an image and upload it to something like that, it's all relied upon these connections that are drawing from a database that you've created, right? And so one of the things that I want to do to complicate how that ease of drawing information from a database happens is by actually incorporating the messiness of breath, right? So one of the things that I'm working on currently, and I'm actually happy to say that I'm pretty close to like, not perfecting it, but getting it almost right, is having breath be part of it. So what happens when you breathe a certain way to access certain things, right? Or to, not to access things, but to open up certain new spaces, open up new objects. And so what happens if you try to pant into if you're using your phone for AR, for example, right? Panting into your microphone on your phone, right? You have to not get it exactly right, but you have to do work to get it, right? And I think that disrupts the easiness. For that, it would unlock certain things around specific chapters that I'm working on, but that would also unlock, so each chapter is based on, for the larger project is based on, each chapter is based on a certain phenomenology of breath, right? So the first one is fugitive breathing, which is panting. The second one is thinking about labored breathing, so coughing and environmental risk and occupational hazard. The third one is thinking about hip hop and rap and queer temporalities. The final one is thinking about sighing. And then I have a sort of final wrap up section on conspiracy and breathing together, right? And so for each of those, I want there to be a certain kind of work that's put in, like not just embodied work of like, I'm just going to pant into this phone, right? But a conscious decision and a thought about why it is that you're doing the thing that you're doing, right? So when the app opens, it opens with a sort of brief overview of as to how to use things, but then it asks you to like answer these certain things. So like, how are you feeling mentally today? Emotionally today, you know? Have you like done XYZ kinds of work on yourself before you can enter into these spaces, right? Can you, like, you know, do you have a good definition of what racism is? What sexism is, you know, like what black feminism is? Have you read Patricia Hill Collins today? That's like one of the things I include at the very beginning. It's like, have you read, you know, Christina Sharp today? And like to try to prompt the user to not just, you know, engage with the things that I have, but to expand what they're using to engage with things that I have, you know, what sorts of knowledge and what sorts of like vocabularies they're using to engage with what I have, right? And so by having them pant or by having them sigh or by having them moan or something like that, those open up certain or bring to the forefront certain textures, certain text, certain objects, certain sounds, certain videos, and those open up into even more that you can like point to, right? So every nodule that I have, or every piece of, or every object that I have has, and I've made this is the most difficult part, I have at least 20 other connecting things to each one of them, and that's been the hardest part, right? So like trying to make it sort of how this is really expansive, because one of the things that I want to really get at is how do we think about racialization, how do we think about breath, how do we think about blackness in its larger totality, right? In its particulars, right? So particular moments like Eric Garner, like Eric Harris, like Sandra Bland, like Black Thought's freestyle, you know, which I mentioned yesterday, and then it's in its particulate matter, right? So like, for example, on the section that is about environmental racism, you know, tracing the different chemicals that are being released in Louisiana's Cancer Alley, how do we trace those, you know? So I have one little nodule that's all on carbon dioxide. I have one that's on ammonia. And it doesn't just give you the data about how much is being released, you know, per day in Louisiana, along the alley, but it also gives you tracing of how it's being used in other kinds of, products that we use in everyday sort of situations, how it's, connected to the release of ammonia in the third world countries, and so it is about thinking really on a massive scale about how we can do things. And one of the things I also want to do is like make it so people can actually add their own information to sections, right? So every nodule is going to be an option on the bottom with a little like plus sign where you can add either a story you have, or a little bit of data that you have found or information that you know, because I want this to become just expansive. But of course, by doing that, it becomes messy, right?
Right.
Because then you never get the full picture. And every time you would reapproach it, it's a different thing you're like looking at every single time, right? Even on the back end, it can easily become messy. And I mean, on the back end, I have to make sure things are somewhat ordered to make sure everything connects properly. But it is about making things hard work at all moments that you can, right? And part of that hard work is making things messy. I'm not going to make it easy for you. I'm not going to give you easy lines through which you can come to the same conclusion. It's like every time you go into the pants section, every time you go into the science section, it's going to give you a different thing.
So I appreciate your answer, and you actually got to answering the next question that I was going to ask, but I'm still going to ask it.
Go ahead
so
and
it's
ask it,
very apparent to our audience and everyone else. But at AADHum, we think a lot about harm reduction and care and what it means to make all of this information available to such a wide audience. And it sounds like you've thought through that and you're making it difficult for people to access it. So even though it's available, they have to do some work in order to access what we might consider cultural gems or nodes that people have used towards liberation. So can you just talk about that connection more specifically?
Yeah. And so, I mean, as you said, I mentioned it, but one of the things I do is I have the training sessions at the beginning. I call them training sessions because I haven't quite thought of what else I will call them in this moment. So I'll be open for anybody who has any suggestions about what I can call this. But it is exactly that. Like, I want people to do the reading and the hard work before they even get to anything that I'm going to have open and available to them, right? So a lot of it is about, making sure that how the work that I do, which is reading a ton of like Black feminist thought, reading a ton of work that is done by Indigenous scholars, reading a ton of work that's being done on like breath and breathing and racialization and sexuality and gender and all these things. All that work has to be built into it, and so part of that is citational practice. So anything that I cite or anything that I use or look at is like built into that project, right? So when I say that how the app opens with like, have you read Christina Sharp today? I do mean that, right? Like you have to, and if you say yes, then it's like, okay, can you talk about weathering Christina Sharp, Can you talk about what she says about aspiration? Like, and those answers I think are going to be so crucial, right? Because sure, somebody can, click yes and type in anything and still gain access, right? But I also think it's one of those things where it's a good faith, sort of thing. And I believe that most people, if they're asked these things and if they're prompted with all these like questions and things, they are going to do a little bit more digging, right? But that is one of the things that I want to be really conscious of as I'm producing this final project. The other thing too is that how I do want to make sure that how at the end of the day people whose daily lived embodiments are not ones in which I'm talking about in the app don't feel like they walk out of the experience feeling as if they now have new empathy or sympathy, right? Which is one of the dangers of using VR, right? Everybody talks about this, like, if only we can use VR. Suddenly, I used VR and suddenly I understood what it was like to be a Black man, facing, police violence, and that is so problematic, and we all know that at this point, hopefully. That's one of the things that I want to avoid, right? So it's not about, putting on a VR headset and when you look down, you're seeing certain things. It's about an experience of learning, an experience of creating your own knowledge, experiencing being community, right? So especially for the last section, which I talk about conspiracy, you have to actually get 5 other people to breathe with you to gain access to that section. And that is about being community, and that is about having those conversations, those really hard conversations about not just the app, but also about what's going on in our like contemporary moment, what has been going on, how do we think about, things moving forward and the futures that we want. And then the other thing that I'll say is how one of the things I always think about is this serving not just like Black life right now, but is this serving Black futures?
Mhm.
And if so, what are those futures that I hope to see, or what are those futures that I'm hoping I'm serving? And so again, one of the things that I really want to privilege in the actual project is exactly that, creating community. So like, what does it mean to approach these things and be in community with others and have these dialogues? What does it mean to gain some knowledge about a thing and then be made to go out and learn more about other things and imagine different kinds of futures? And then also what it is to approach questions that we have from different lenses and angles, right? So some of the things that I include are, visual, and we can talk about visual epistemologies and the kinds of evidentiary like basis in which they're like used. But also there's lots of things that are audio based. Some of them are going to be haptic, so vibrations from your phone, to certain beats. Some of them are going to be, the hope is that eventually I can make this into a larger installation, and I can actually have a space where I can have certain scents in the room, in addition to like not just the sound, the video, all these things. And then also certain kinds of temperatures I would have for certain aspects of it. But for right now, it's a little bit scaled back in that. But it is about trying to imagine where we can go from here, right? And so that's why I called it whole space, because I am thinking about not just the whole of the slave ship or the whole of the spaceship, but I am trying to also think about where do we go from here. It's not just about this sort of Afro-pessimist thinking where it's, well, let's look about anti-Blackness. It's also about like Black culture productions have been talking about breath since day one, right? And they're doing work around breath that is amazing and that is liberatory. So how do we replicate that? How do we move that forward? And where do we go from here? So yeah.
That's great. I want to ask you, open it up for questions. So do you all have any questions? I have plenty of more questions, but I also want to give you all a chance to engage with Kim.
Can you talk more about like the skills you've had to learn to do this project?
Yes. Okay. So many skills, right?
I'm sure.
This is a story, and I promise there's a pointer. So I can't drink caffeine. I'm really sensitive to caffeine, but when I drink caffeine, I go into this fugue state that makes me hyper focused on one thing. So as I was mocking up the the book form of this project, which again is now like falling apart and all these different things, as I was mocking it up, I was like, maybe I should try to think about other mediums that I can do this work in. I think maybe I can do AR, because I was at the time thinking about the textural. And when I say textural, I'm borrowing that from Doug Kearney, who spells it TEXTU parentheses R, close parentheses AL. So it's textual and textural. So I was thinking about that a lot, right? So like, what does the text on the page do, and what can't it do, and what are the textures that it gives you, and what are the textures that I want to add to it, right? And I was like, I feel like maybe I can start approaching this question from a different angle. I can approach the question of the invisible and the ephemeral and the thing that you can't touch from a different angle if I do AR. So I drank a ton of coffee and super caffeinated tea, and I went and I downloaded the game designing hub Unity, and then I also downloaded Unreal Engine, which is a little bit more, that one is a little bit more for graphics and rendering I use it for, but I downloaded Unity because at the time they were the only ones that were doing sort of more open access AR and VR development, and I sat down and I just read the entire manual. And as I was reading the manual, I just like, blink, blink, blink. So I had to learn C#. I had to learn, so that's the programming language. I had to learn all these little different like hacks and things. I looked online, so somewhat, there's no like clear documentation on how to do a lot of AR stuff. So a lot of it is just sort of piecemeal looking at the code that people write for other programs. So I spent a lot of time on GitHub looking at the back end of people's projects, trying to read that. I had to learn some other, not very well, but some other programming languages to read what they were doing. I did a lot of research on other kinds of just like digital projects, not even AR or VR projects, just like projects that were looking at, text mining, or projects that were looking at sonifying, Wikipedia entries and all these different things. Just did a ton of little research on that. But the major thing was just learning how to use Unity, the program, and that took a very long time. I promise I stopped using coffee and caffeine after a while. But I also got hyper obsessed with it, and even to today, a lot of things break because every time it updates. So one of the things that I grapple with a lot is, so I've learned C#, I've learned all these other different languages, I've learned all these different skills, and but I'm faced with updates which break things all the time. So I don't update things. I've stopped updating it. The other thing that I'm faced with is how I use a Mac for a lot of these things, and my Mac is not very powerful. So actually what happens is how I'll try to load something and it'll take a while, right? So I've had to learn how to use Adobe Photoshop and After Effects to try to get some of the more, what's the word I'm looking for? The more stylish, I don't know what you call it. The little bit more rendered parts of it done, right? So it's not just text, but actually how do we get the images to look very high quality and all these things like that I had to sort of learn how to do. And I wouldn't call myself an expert by any means because everything I've done, I've learned specifically for the project I'm doing. So if you ask me, Kim, can you teach me how to use Adobe After Effects? I can say, sure, I can teach you exactly what I know about this one thing. But a lot of it was just sort of piecemealing things together and pulling from here and there and trying to learn from as many people that I could who knew something or the other, right? And one of the things I already knew before I went into the project that I could do, I knew how to build a website. So I already had confidence that I could at least learn a programming language well enough to do something with it, right? I knew the basics of a lot of different things, again, text mining, how to make a basic image look better, how to do a little bit of graphic design. These were some of the basic skills that I already had before I went into the project, and so it gave me the confidence to tackle something that was virtual reality, something that was augmented reality. I will say now, the programs that I use, so Unity and Unreal Engine, are a little bit more user-friendly than they were even last year with the updates that they've been having. And so, especially for Unreal, which it wasn't very user-friendly for a while, they now have this setting where you can use, they call them, I don't know what they call them. I call it nodules, right? And you can drag and drop them. So if you're not somebody who's an actual programmer, you can still actually create something in Unreal. You can still create something in Unity without needing to learn a ton of programming languages. So I actually would say, if you're at all interested in augmented reality or virtual reality and just playing with it, download these programs because they're free. You don't have to pay for them. You can pay obviously for upgraded versions, but the basic version is free. Unity is especially great because everything is free, right? You pay more to get assistance and help, but the baseline is very free. And just play around because they've made it so that how even people who are not specialists can still create something that's, I think, really smart and really thoughtful. So I recommend it. But at the time I was doing a little bit of a, I don't know, caffeine crazed fugue state thing around the project. I'm still very much in love with the project. I think you have to be a little bit in love with the project and a little bit in love with the hard work that it involves. Not in a fetishistic way, but you have to be committed, right? And so yes, that's what I had to do. But it's been fun because I think the other thing too is how when you're doing scholarship, you don't get a lot of times where you finish something, you're like, this feels good, I'm done. There's very little of that, right? Even when you write a chapter, even when you do all these other things, you're never like, this is done, I never have to look at this again, And that doesn't exactly happen with this project, but there is something really nice about having a tangible, concrete thing that you can say, hey, I learned C#. And, none of you guys can take that away from me, And I may forget it, once I'm done, who knows, I don't know. But yeah. Sort of it, yeah.
Where do you source the media that you use in your program?
It's all over the place, right? So some of the media, so if it's music or something like that, I just buy it. And I one of the things that I do is I try my best to deal with copyrights, right? So I spend a lot of time emailing people because when I say I try to connect things to at least 20 other things, a lot of that is just trying to connect it to different images and all these things. So I spend a lot of time emailing museums and independent like photographers and archives and special collections, the Library of Congress. I contact people who have like YouTube channel. Like I just do a lot of that and just saying, hey, I'm creating this project. It's not going to be for profit. It's not going to be majorly accessible to the public yet. It might be in the future. I'm not going to make any money off of this, but it is for my dissertation like project currently. I do plan on, maybe making it a little bit wider than it is right now, because that is one of the things that I want to do, make it larger than just like the academic community. Do I have your permission to use it? What are the terms of those like conditions? And that takes a lot of time if you like, because I am very serious about getting all of those copyrights. That takes a lot of time, and sometimes I don't hear back.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's another difficult thing. Like on the one hand, you have to contact all these people, but on the other hand, like what happens when you don't hear back? I have no shame in pestering, so I like just email constantly. If I haven't heard back after like 5-6 emails, I usually put that document on the side, and I'm like, okay, maybe I'm tackling the wrong person, I'm asking the wrong person, or I'm tackling this the wrong way. Can I find something else that still talks to this, issue and these things? So that takes a lot of time, but I still have a record of all the things that I find, even if they're not included. And one of the things that I have is, as part of the app, it's just gonna list all the things that couldn't be included. Right, so the person can go and find it themselves, even if I can't include it myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, oh, I couldn't get the copyright for this thing, but here's the title and the artist or the author or whoever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Go take a look, So yeah.
Any other questions?
I mean, it's a very, I'm not gonna lie, it's a lot of hard work and it's very time consuming, right? Like you spend a lot of hours just doing this, and it's something that I think if you have a team, it makes it much easier. When it's just one person, it's a lot harder, but I think it's a practice that we all need to embed into the because there's a reason why we cite people when we're, doing scholarship, and it's about giving credit where credit is due, and I'm so serious about that. Like, I'm so paranoid about that stuff. I'm just like, I want to make sure everybody gets their credit because everybody's doing hard work, and it's not just me who's doing the work here, yeah.
And I think that practice also makes visible everything that goes into creating publicly engaged scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
Because so often people from the outside just see the finished product
And
not all of the hours, the caffeine binges,
Yes.
all of that goes
So many.
into it. So that's also something that we're working on at AADHum, how to make visible all of the hands that have touched a project throughout its from its inception to completion, if it's ever complete.
Yeah.
So, thank you for that. Any other questions specifically about the technology or the technical aspects of the projects?
I'd like to stay on citations a little bit and hear a little bit more about how you make those visible, like within the app, right, on the front facing. If I was a user and I wanted to know a photo credit or the artist or, as you said, 20 other academic or non-academic articles that are on this.
Yeah.
How would you, how is that visible, accessible?
Yeah. So that is one of the things I grapple with because at least for some academic texts, they're behind paywalls, right? So you can give the title and you can give the author, but it means nothing if the person has no institutional affiliation or has no way of paying for access to these articles, right? So for that, right now, the thing that I have is I still just give the title to the author where they can find it. But my next phase of the project is to actually reach out to any of the authors that I cite and see if I have their permission to have a PDF version that's accessible, right? I think there's a chance that a lot of them will have to say no because of the copyright issue that they have with their own publishers and all these different things, right? In which case I have a workaround. But that is a very serious issue that I like think about, right? Because some scholarship is open access, but a lot of it is still behind paywall, and a lot of it is about institutional access. So how do we deal with these things? And honestly, I haven't found an easy solution that doesn't infringe on copyrights, that doesn't infringe on the intellectual work that people are doing, and doesn't and that also gives people all the access that I think they should have, right? Like people who aren't related to institutions. And so that is the thing that I'm grappling with right now. And like the way that I'm thinking about it is like, well, if I maybe can reach out to these authors, the actual authors of these texts, and ask them if I have their permission. Because right now most of my focus is on the media that I have, right? Because that is, I think, the most touchy like topic currently, because a lot of it is just media. It's not necessarily academic articles I'm linking to. But that's going to be my next phase, which is like asking, do I have your permission? Even if it's just a proof copy that, you know, somebody can't print out, because again, it's AR and VR, so it's not like you can go out and print it, but you can sit there and read it, you know. Do I have your permission to like upload an image of that? But I don't have an easy answer. I don't know if you have an answer in some way or form.
I
mean,
sort of thinking,
the answer is to destroy capitalism and just make everything.
Yeah.
That is
the
the
ultimate
answer. That is the ultimate answer, but yeah.
I'm thinking about,
Yeah.
I've seen this, well, the first time I saw it was at the Association for Black Women Historians, and all of the panel moderators
Yes.
read the entire bio of every panelist,
Mm-hmm.
which is not common. Like sometimes people will read an abbreviated version, or they'll just say name and institution.
Yeah.
So perhaps, and this isn't like a formal citation,
Yeah.
but maybe there's also a sound recording of something.
Yeah.
And I know that that's not practical for like an entire article.
Yeah.
But perhaps it's like looking at different mediums instead of just the written word as a citation.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. I did think about that for some of the poetry I'm including. Like, I'm applying right now for funds for this project because one of the things I want to do is actually, especially for the poetry, pay the poets that I'm citing to read some of the lines that I'm using. But I hadn't really thought about actually just having maybe even if it's not the full article, the abstract at least of articles be read, which I think would be really great, because then hopefully that gives some sort of overview of what the argument or the arc of the argument is of the article for people who don't have access. That's a really great idea, yeah.
And then also I'm just thinking about beyond the visual,
Yeah.
looking at or thinking about different ways to express what I think you're trying to get at, that is often not part of the written word, or often not part of the visual, and part of those cues is through hearing.
Yeah.
Any other questions, ideas, comments? Everyone's in awe. So I did have a question that is a little bit beyond just the technical use, but perhaps it has some relevance. I think a lot about being Black in the Anthropocene and what people are calling the climate crisis, and how for Black folks we've lived through many crises. So in a sense, the climate crisis is different for us than it is for some other folks. And it, in the same way, like Indigenous folks who live here, they've experienced crises, and so many other people. But I just wanted to know, do you think about that in your project, because it deals with environmental injustices? And so I guess, like, can you talk a little bit about your methodology and how you think about doing this project in the crises?
It definitely is centered in my work, not just because I have a section that is about environmental racism, but because it's exactly that thing, right? So I think one of the things it depends when you think the Anthropocene begins, right? Like whether it begins in the Industrial Revolution or whether it begins in the Agrarian, whatever it is. I think the point is of how the crisis of where we're in currently in terms of not just climate, but in terms of like the geological period we're in is undeniably connected to all these other issues around race and all these things, right? And I think one of the things that I thought was really interesting, this was maybe 2 years ago, I was in a conversation with the scholar Kyle Powers White, who is a professor at MSU, and one of the things he was saying about climate change, climate crisis, the Anthropocene, all these different things was, he was like, the thing is that, you know, it's a new crisis for some people, right? Because obviously we can all know that how climate change, climate crisis has been a crisis for a lot of different communities for a very long time, right? Long before it became an issue, you know, or seen as not really an issue in certain spaces. But one of the things he said was that how, you know, for Indigenous communities, the the apocalypse already happened, right?
Yes, yeah.
All the things that already
Mhm.
that we foresee happening, right? Which is how you have to migration has to suddenly enforce migration in certain ways, and the entire landscape in which you lived your life as a community is completely drastically changed.
Right.
Loss of resources, all these things that's already happened to indigenous populations, right? And I think that has not in a comparable even analogous way, but I think there are certain crises around climate and certain crises around just, I think, existence in the world that are also faced by Black and brown folk just in general, right? Black, brown, and indigenous folk all the time, right? And so I think about that a lot because I think about the technology that I use, right? Like all the phones that we have, all of the VR headset that I use, the laptops that I'm producing all these things on, right? Like we can think about all the different minerals and that are being mined for in South Africa or mined for in Latin America, all of these different places that are being mined for by Black and brown bodies, right? Undeniably connected. And so when I think about it, I think I try to move again from totalities to particulate matter, right? So if we're worried about this totality that is climate change and the climate crisis, I think it's also really important in these moments when we're thinking about sort of large scale solutions to bring it down to very particular moments and particular spaces, because different solutions are necessary for different places, right? And we already know, for example, that how the brunt of pollution that is experienced in the United States is borne by Black and brown folk, particularly Black folk, and the majority of people who produce the pollution are white folk, right? There have been all these studies that have been done, and so the reason why I focus on Louisiana's Cancer Alley as my space or geographical construct for thinking about the Anthropocene and thinking about climate crisis is precisely because it's this almost 100-mile stretch that is on one side bordered by the river, and then on the other side is bordered by all these Black towns that were either owned or filled with or had communities of previously enslaved folk that were then moved for these corporations, right? So we're seeing here already the forced migrations that are happening in a minuscule way, right? That are echoing the forced migrations that are happening from enslavement and from before. That are these small, predominantly Black towns, all Black towns that are being moved to produce and to create these, large companies like Exxon and all the host of them. And then each time those towns move, right, they get renamed new things, and each time those towns move, actually, the land upon which the corporations are building their new sites are actually old plantations, right? Because the towns that are being built, these predominantly Black towns that are now no longer there, for a lot of them, were built around or on plantations. So these companies are not being built on these old plantations, and they have the names of these old plantations, right, still. And so that connection there, I think, can't be erased, right? Or effaced, right? There's a direct line between indigenous dispossession on the one hand, because all of that land already, we know, already was indigenous land, indigenous dispossession, enslavement, right? Because they were being built on these what used to once be plantations, and then the current contemporary crisis, which is all of this pollution is being produced in this 100-mile tract of land. And in the U.S., you can look at the top 10 producers of pollution. Texas is one of the major ones. Louisiana is I forgot what ranking is, maybe it's 8th or something like that. But the thing about Louisiana is how the population, it's the most densely populated space in the U.S. that has such high levels of pollution, and it's all Black folk, right? And so what do we think about that connection there, and how do we grapple with that? And that's, I think, so crucial to thinking globally, because as we're thinking about these pollution that's happening in the U.S. context, you have to think about how all the technology that we're using to look at this pollution is actually being built by, Black and brown labor globally, and all the things that make up the components that we're looking at, whether it's the little diamonds or whatever it is, it's being mined for by kids essentially.
Right, extracted.
Yes, it's all of that
It's
language
based
of
on an extracted
it's all of that
economy.
extracted, yeah. And so I think if we're thinking about extraction as the way I think of the Anthropocene and the climate crisis is all around extraction, and just like unlimited greed around that. And I think if we're thinking about the Anthropocene, no matter when we think it might begin, it is about the extraction of certain kinds of resources without care for the outcomes. I think we can't erase the fact that how one of the major systems of extraction today, at least for us, is like, you know, capitalism, and that is built upon like Black enslavement. So
Right.
yeah.
Right. Thank you for that. The final question that I'll ask
Yes.
you is a bigger, broader question.
Yes.
Where do you see Black DH going in the next few years?
So I think one of the things that I find really exciting about Black DH currently, and I think in the past, and I think going forward, is that how it's always approached the question of not just of DH and of Blackness and of Black DH together, from really creative and really unsuspecting angles. And I think that is something that I'm really looking forward to seeing in the future. I think that's something that's going to remain part of it, right? I think also not just a commitment to surprising and new ways of thinking about questions, but also I think a commitment to communities and commitments to embedding specific politics into the projects, I think is another thing that's going to continue forward, right? So, I mean, I think there was a proliferation of Black DH projects, especially I think around like questions of Black Lives Matter and Ferguson and all these things, right? But I think even if we like look before that, like what we can, if we expand how we think of the digital, right? We have all of these Black digital projects that are happening along with, like I think of Julie, you know, I think of the Daughters of the Dust, Julie Dash's film, to like, that's actually I think of a Black DH project in a very expansive way. Like I'm here for that. Like that is a Black DH project, and that is doing something politically, that is doing something stylistic, that is doing something, like it's making people work. And I think that is the thing that Black DH always does. It is about putting in the work, making people do the work, and making that work not easy, right? And I think that is why the energies around Black DH is so crucial to have in other spaces of DH work, or just other spaces of scholarship and creative products. So I think that's where it's going to continue going, because it's already doing that work, and I think there's going to be a proliferation of more projects around these ideas, because there are a lot of different technologies are becoming a little bit more accessible as they come, even as others are becoming more inaccessible. So like I said, like things like Unity and all these things, like just the back end of it becomes a little more easily manipulatable, so that how you don't have to be an expert to produce things. And I think that is a really crucial thing. I think also Black DH is always somewhat centered around pedagogy and teaching, whether it's in the classroom or communities. And so I think that is going to help spread seeds that we want to see growing in the future. But yeah.
Great. That's wonderful. I'm a historian, so I'm always trying to prove that Black DH
it exists.
is ancient.
Can we think about,
It's ancient.
Okay.
So,
it is ancient.
I'm looking at, for example, like
braiding.
material culture.
Braiding is a great
It's
example.
code.
It is
It's
literally
code.
code. It's fractals. Like you're telling me how that is, okay. We agree.
So, yes.
We agree.
And
so
this is where we're going to end.
It's where we're going to end.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Kim.
Thank you guys
Really
for coming.
appreciate you being here.